In the suffocating silence of a basement converted into an archive amidst dusty stacks of classified documents and magnetic tapes forgotten by time, an extraordinary discovery awaited its moment to emerge from the shadows. It was the autumn of 2019 when Mark Chen, a young historian specializing in covert government programs, stumbled upon an unmarked metal box buried among declassified Cold War reports. What he couldn't imagine is that this chance find would reveal one of the most profound and disturbing conversations ever recorded on the nature of human existence. The handwritten label on the side of the box bore only a name and a date: Dr. Harold Puthoff, NIST, September 1995. Chen knew the name well. Puthoff had been a leading scientist behind the CIA's paranormal investigation programs, including the famous Stargate project, which studied extrasensory perception and remote viewing for decades. But this specific tape was not listed in any official archives, as if it had been deliberately omitted from the historical record. When Chen finally managed to play the recording on a vintage machine found in the same archive, he heard a tired but still penetrating voice from the then septuagenarian Dr. Puthoff. The audio quality suggested that the conversation had been recorded in an intimate setting, perhaps in the scientist's own home. Even more intriguing was the fact that Puthoff was speaking alone, as if dictating memories or confessions to a personal recorder, far from the official ears that had always monitored his work. "Today is September 15, 1995, began the recorded voice, laden with a melancholy that contrasted with the scientific precision for which Puthoff was known. It's been 40 years that I've dedicated my life to investigating the mysteries of human consciousness, always within the limits imposed by government bureaucracy and academic skepticism. But there are truths that transcend national security protocols, truths that belong to all of humanity, and I no longer have time to carry these secrets alone." The confession that followed revealed decades of clandestine research that went beyond the officially documented experiments. Puthoff described how in the secret CIA labs he and his team had developed technologies capable of detecting and measuring what traditional science refused to acknowledge: the presence of conscious energy fields that persisted after physical death. These weren't just speculative theories or experiments with dubious mediums. They were precise measurements, quantifiable data, irrefutable evidence that human consciousness possessed a nature that transcended the biological limits of the brain. The scientist recounted how the first signs of this discovery emerged during remote viewing experiments conducted in the 1970s. Trained volunteers could not only visualize distant locations with impressive accuracy, but also reported contact with presences that identified themselves as deceased individuals. Initially, these experiences were dismissed as products of imagination or psychological contamination. However, when the reports began to include verifiable information about the lives and deaths of these people, information that the volunteers could not have obtained through conventional means, Puthoff's team realized they were facing something much deeper. "I remember the case of Sarah Mitchell," Puthoff murmured in the recording, his voice trembling slightly, "a young researcher who had participated in our experiments before dying in a car accident in 1978. 2 years after her death, during a remote viewing session with one of our best agents, she began to communicate with us. It wasn't cheap spiritualism or dramatic staging. It was Sarah, with her personality intact, her characteristic mannerisms, her specific memories about projects she had worked on, and she brought us information about experiments we were developing, data that proved to be absolutely correct." As the recording continued, Puthoff described how these experiences became more frequent and sophisticated. The team developed rigorous protocols to verify the authenticity of the communications, applying the same scientific standards they used in other research. They discovered that discarnate consciousnesses not only maintained their identities and memories intact, but also demonstrated expanded capacities of perception and understanding. They could access information about future events, understand complex connections between seemingly disconnected phenomena, and offer insights into the fundamental nature of reality that surprised even the most experienced scientists. "Death," we realized, "is not the end of the conscious journey, but a transformation," the scientist continued. It's as if the human soul were a multifaceted diamond, and physical life allows us to see only one of its facets. When the body is gone, all the other facets are revealed, showing dimensions of existence that we can barely imagine while we are bound to dense matter. One of the most shocking discoveries described in the recording was the existence of what Puthoff called conscious hierarchies in the spiritual plane. The entities with which they communicated did not exist in a homogeneous void, but were organized into levels of development and understanding. Some still maintained a strong connection to their earthly experiences, while others had evolved to states of consciousness so expanded that they could barely communicate in understandable human language. Imagine an infinite library, Puthoff explained, using a metaphor that would become recurring in his accounts, where each soul is simultaneously a book and a reader. Some are still on the first pages, processing their earthly experiences, while others have already moved on to volumes of wisdom that encompass multiple existences and dimensions of reality, and they all have access to a collective knowledge that transcends any physical library we can conceive. The most disturbing aspect of Puthoff's accounts was his description of how the American government attempted to use these discoveries for military and intelligence purposes. He spoke of experiments where they tried to establish communication with soldiers killed in combat to obtain information about enemy movements, or to contact deceased scientists to accelerate the development of new technologies. Many of these attempts failed, not because of technical limitations, but because the discarnate consciousness is seen to operate according to ethical principles that transcended national loyalties or military objectives. They don't see us as Americans or Russians, capitalists or communists, the scientist reflected. To them, we're just souls at different stages of evolution, and their priorities are aligned with the spiritual growth of humanity as a whole, not with temporary geopolitical advantages. That's when I realized we were facing an intelligence that had transcended not only death, but also the limitations of perspective that bind us while we're incarnate. As the recording progressed, Puthoff described his own personal experiences with the phenomenon. He recounted how, during the experiments, he began to develop a growing sensitivity to spiritual presences, perceiving entities that accompanied him in his daily life. Initially, these experiences frightened him, as they challenged his entire materialistic scientific training. Gradually, however, he learned to recognize these presences as benevolent guides offering protection and guidance. "My father died when I was 15, Puthoff revealed, his voice thick with emotion. For decades I carried the pain of our last conversation, an argument about my academic plans that ended without reconciliation. At 52, during a particularly intense research session, I felt his presence unequivocally. He was there, not as a memory or psychological projection, but as a living, loving consciousness. And he told me, with a clarity that still moves me, that he had never stopped accompanying me, that love transcends any earthly misunderstanding, and that he was proud of the man I had become." For those who follow extraordinary journeys like this, where the boundary between science and spirituality dissolves, revealing truths that transform our understanding of existence, it's worth remembering that stories like this continue to emerge from humanity's secret archives, waiting for open minds willing to explore the deepest mysteries of our reality. Puthoff also described how the research revealed consistent patterns about the process of transition between life and death. According to his observations, based on hundreds of communications with discarnate entities, the moment of physical death was not traumatic for consciousness, but similar to waking from a particularly vivid dream. Most souls reported an initial feeling of confusion, followed by a gradual recognition of their new condition. Many were greeted by family and friends who had passed before, creating an emotional continuity that eased the transition. One of the most comforting discoveries, the scientist continued, was realizing that genuine love creates bonds that death cannot break. Couples who deeply loved each other, parents and children, true friends, all maintain energetic connections that allow for immediate reunions after the transition. It's as if love were a universal language that transcends physical limits, a vibrational frequency that allows for instant recognition between kindred spirits. As the recording delved into the more technical aspects of the discoveries, Puthoff explained how his team had developed equipment capable of detecting the energetic signatures of these discarnate consciousnesses. Using a combination of conventional technologies and experimental devices based on quantum principles, they were able to map energy fields that behaved intelligently, responding to stimuli and demonstrating complex patterns of organization. We discovered that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but a fundamental force of the universe that uses the brain as an interface during physical incarnation, Puthoff explained. It's similar to the relationship between a pianist and their instrument. The piano doesn't create the music, but allows the musician to express themselves. When the instrument breaks, the musician doesn't disappear, they just need to find other ways of expression. One of the most impressive passages of the recording dealt with what Puthoff called the Akashic Record, an informational field where all the experiences and knowledge of all consciousnesses were stored and shared. The entities with whom they communicated had access to this universal repository, allowing them to provide information about historical events, future scientific developments, and profound connections between different aspects of reality. Imagine if every thought, every emotion, every experience lived by any conscious being left a permanent mark on an invisible dimension of reality, the scientist described with reverence, and that sufficiently evolved beings could access this cosmic library, understanding not only what happened, but also the implications and connections of each event. That's what our research suggested, a universe where nothing is lost, where every life contributes to a collective knowledge that transcends time and space. Puthoff also recounted experiences where the discarnate entities demonstrated the ability to influence physical events, moving objects, altering electromagnetic fields, and even appearing visually to sensitive individuals. These manifestations were not constant or predictable, seeming to depend on factors such as the strength of the emotional bond with living people, the importance of the message to be conveyed, and the level of spiritual development of the entity. Eleanor Roosevelt once visited us, Puthoff revealed with a tone of awe that came through even the old recording. It wasn't a medium simulating her personality or our collective imagination, it was really her, with all her characteristic energy, her concern for social justice, and her unique perspective on human nature. She told us how her death had expanded her understanding of the social problems that had so concerned her in life, and how she continued to work, in other dimensions, to inspire leaders and activists who could continue her mission on Earth. As the recording neared its climax, Puthoff described his own spiritual transformation resulting from decades of exposure to these extraordinary realities. He spoke about how his materialistic scientific worldview had gradually expanded to encompass dimensions of existence that conventional science still refused to consider. He hadn't abandoned scientific rigor, but had broadened his definition of reality to include phenomena that didn't fit into traditional paradigms. True science, Dr. Peter Holloway philosophized, shouldn't be limited by what we can measure with our current instruments, but expanded by everything we can observe and verify, even if we don't fully understand the mechanisms involved. Consciousness surviving physical death is an observable and verifiable fact that we can't yet fully explain how it happens, doesn't invalidate the reality of the phenomenon. The recording's climax arrived when Dr. Holloway described his own near-death experience during emergency heart surgery in 1994. He recounted how, during the moments he was clinically declared dead, his consciousness separated from his body, and he found himself in a dimension of light and knowledge transcending any earthly experience. There, he was greeted by fellow scientists who had died years before, including the young Sarah Mitchell he'd mentioned at the beginning of the recording. Sarah was radiant, enveloped in a light that seemed to emanate from her very being. Dr. Holloway described, his voice choked with emotion, "She showed me how our earthly research was only a tiny fraction of the knowledge available in that dimension. I saw connections between all living beings, understood how every action, Every thought, every act of love or compassion created ripples that spread across multiple realities. And she told me it was my time to return to my physical body, to share these truths with the world, even if it meant breaking protocols and challenging established scientific paradigms. During this transcendental experience, Dr. Holloway recounted understanding that physical life was merely a temporary school, where souls came to learn specific lessons and develop qualities like love, compassion, courage, and wisdom. Death wasn't a punishment or an end, but a graduation, a return to the spiritual home, laden with new experiences and understandings that enriched universal collective knowledge. I saw how each soul chooses its earthly experiences before incarnating, the scientist revealed. We aren't victims of chance or cruel fate, but conscious architects of our own growth journeys. We choose our challenges, our families, our significant encounters, all with the purpose of developing specific aspects of our spiritual nature. And when the lesson is complete, we return home to integrate those experiences and plan our next growth adventure. The recording neared its end with Dr. Holloway offering a profound reflection on the meaning of these discoveries for humanity. He spoke of how the knowledge of the continuity of consciousness could completely transform our approach to life, death, human relationships, and existential purpose. If people truly understood that death was merely a transition and that their earthly actions had eternal consequences, the entire structure of human society would be revolutionized. Imagine a world where people knew, with scientific certainty, that they would continue to exist after physical death, Dr. Holloway mused, where they understood that genuine love creates eternal bonds, that every act of kindness resonates across multiple dimensions, that we are all connected in a cosmic web of shared consciousness. How would that change our priorities? How would it influence our politics, our economy, our personal relationships? The scientist also addressed the dangers of keeping this knowledge secret. He argued that hiding these discoveries from humanity was not only morally questionable, but potentially dangerous. Without a broader understanding of the spiritual nature of existence, humanity would continue to make the same mistakes, perpetuating cycles of violence, greed, and separation that could lead to self-destruction. World leaders who know these truths have a moral responsibility to share them, Dr. Holloway declared with growing conviction, not as religious dogma or philosophical speculation, but as verifiable scientific discovery. Humanity deserves to know that we are more than just temporary physical bodies, that our existence has purpose and meaning that transcend any political or economic agenda. In the final moments of the recording, Dr. Holloway made a passionate appeal for future generations of scientists to continue this research, regardless of institutional pressures or academic skepticism. He encouraged young researchers to keep open minds, to question established paradigms, and to pursue truth, even when it challenged comfortable concepts about the nature of reality. Truth does not fear investigation, Dr. Holloway concluded, his voice tired but resolute. If these discoveries are genuine, they will withstand any rigorous scientific scrutiny. If they are not, they deserve to be discarded. But ignoring them out of prejudice or fear is a betrayal of the fundamental principles of scientific inquiry. We are explorers of mysteries, unravelers of hidden truths, and the greatest truth of all is that human consciousness is eternal, and that love is the most powerful force in the universe. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only the characteristic hiss of old tapes and the weight of revelations that could fundamentally transform our understanding of life, death, and the purpose of human existence. Mark Chen, the historian who discovered this extraordinary confession, realized he held in his hands not just a historical document, but a window into truths humanity had sought throughout its existence. As silence returned to the dusty archive, Chen contemplated the implications of these revelations. If true, they suggested that each of us is far more than we seem, that our earthly journey is only a chapter in a much larger cosmic story, and that love, compassion, and spiritual growth are the only truly valuable currencies in the infinite universe of eternal consciousness. And perhaps, Chen reflected, carefully putting away the tape, this is precisely the truth the world needs to hear.